A boy thinks he rescued a puppy after finding it cold and crying alone in the woods. It's tiny, barely bigger than his hand, so he hides it in his sleeping bag, thinking he's just saved a life. But as days pass, the puppy starts mimicking his smile, copying his movements, and never leaves his side. That's when his sister makes a chilling discovery. This isn't a dog, and it may not even belong in the wild. What is this creature really? And what happens when a stranger comes looking for it? This powerful story of connection, sacrifice, and one unforgettable bond will stay with you long after the final scene. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Leo pressed his forehead against the car window, watching trees blur past as their SUV bounced along the narrow dirt road. The late summer sun filtered through the leaves, creating dancing shadows across his lap. Next to him, Ava slumped in her seat, earbuds firmly in place. Though Leo knew she wasn't actually listening to anything, it was just her way of saying, "Leave me alone." "Almost there, everyone," Dad called from behind the wheel, his voice carrying that forced cheerfulness Leo had gotten used to lately. "Just a few more minutes to our home away from home." Mom turned around in the passenger seat, her gentle smile reaching her eyes. "This is going to be wonderful. When was the last time we all spent a weekend together? Just us." "Before phones took over our lives," Dad added, catching Ava's eye in the rearview mirror. "Speaking of which," Ava groaned, pulling out her earbuds. We know. Hand them over." They'd arrived at a small wooden guard station marking the entrance to the Restricted Nature Reserve. A weathered sign read, "Protected Wildlife Area, Authorized Access Only." Dad rolled down his window, showing their camping permit to the ranger, while Mom held out a small basket. "Phones, please," she said softly. "This is our digital detox weekend, remember?" Leo handed his over without protest. He rarely used it anyway. Ava made a show of dramatically placing hers in the basket, as if surrendering a vital organ. "This is so unfair," she muttered. "What if there's an emergency?" "The ranger station has a landline," Dad explained patiently. "And I have a satellite phone for real emergencies. But this weekend is about reconnecting with nature and with each other." The SUV crawled down the bumpy trail, branches occasionally scraping against the windows. Leo watched a squirrel dart across their path, disappearing into the underbrush. He usually loved animals, but today he felt strangely disconnected, like he was watching everything through a fog. They finally pulled into a small clearing. Their designated campsite was marked by a simple fire pit surrounded by stones, with enough flat ground for their 2 tents. The trees formed a natural canopy overhead, letting through patches of warm sunlight. "All right, troops," Dad clapped his hands together as they piled out of the car. "Let's get camp set up before dark. Ava, help your mother with the tents. Leo, you're on firewood duty. Stay within sight of camp, okay?" Leo nodded, grateful for a solo task. He watched as Ava reluctantly joined Mom in untangling tent poles, while Dad started unpacking their supplies. The forest around them was alive with afternoon sounds. Birds calling, leaves rustling, branches creaking in the gentle breeze. He began gathering fallen branches, creating a small pile near the fire pit. A flash of red caught his eye, a cardinal hopping from branch to branch. Without thinking, Leo followed it, picking up promising pieces of firewood along the way. The cardinal led him deeper into the woods, just a little further than he probably should have gone. The bird's bright feathers stood out against the green foliage, like a tiny beacon drawing him forward. Leo barely noticed how far he'd wandered until the cardinal suddenly took flight, disappearing into the canopy above. That's when he heard it, a soft, rhythmic squealing sound, unlike anything he'd heard before. It reminded him of squeezing a rubber toy, but more alive, more urgent. Leo stood perfectly still, listening. The sound came again, from somewhere near his feet. Carefully, he knelt down and brushed aside some damp fallen leaves. His heart skipped a beat. There, curled up in a tiny ball, was a creature unlike anything Leo had ever seen. It was small enough to fit in his palm, with delicate bat-like ears that twitched at his presence. Its skin was a soft pinkish color, almost translucent in the filtered sunlight. But it was the creature's eyes that held him transfixed, large, watery, and filled with what looked like intelligence and fear. The tiny being let out another squeaking sound, trembling as it looked up at Leo. Its gaze seemed to reach right into his heart, awakening something protective inside him. The creature chirped again, a sound so helpless and lonely it made Leo's chest ache. He glanced around quickly, checking if anyone else was nearby. The campsite felt very far away now, though he could still faintly hear Ava complaining about tent stakes. Making a decision, Leo carefully scooped up the small creature, which offered no resistance. "Shh," he whispered, gently wrapping it in the corner of his flannel shirt. "I got you." The creature snuggled into the warm fabric, its trembling subsiding slightly. Leo hurried back toward camp, his mind racing. He couldn't leave it alone in the woods. It seemed too small, too vulnerable. But he knew his parents wouldn't let him keep a wild animal, especially not one he found in a restricted nature reserve. Back at the campsite, everyone was busy with their tasks. Mom and Ava had managed to get one tent up and were working on the second. Dad was organizing their food supplies, hanging some in a tree to keep away from bears. No one noticed as Leo quickly unzipped his duffel bag and created a small nest using his spare sweatshirt. The creature barely made a sound as he gently placed it in the makeshift bed. It curled up immediately, still shivering slightly, but its eyes remained fixed on Leo's face. Looking at it more closely now, he couldn't match it to any animal he'd ever seen in his dad's nature books or science classes. "Noko," he whispered, the name coming to him suddenly and feeling exactly right. The creature's ears perked up slightly at the sound. Leo zipped the bag most of the way closed, leaving just enough space for air. "Whatever you are, I've got you now." As darkness settled over the campsite, Leo fidgeted with his dinner, pushing the campfire-cooked beans around his plate. His mind kept drifting to the tiny creature hidden in his duffel bag. He hadn't dared check on Noko since returning to camp, afraid of drawing attention. "You've barely touched your food, sweetie," Mom said, reaching over to feel his forehead. "Are you feeling okay?" Leo ducked away from her hand, but tried to smile. "Just tired from all the walking and stuff. Can I go to bed early?" Dad looked up from stoking the fire. "Everything all right, bud? You usually love camping." "I'm fine," Leo insisted, standing up with his half-full plate. "The fresh air just made me sleepy." Ava snorted from her camp chair. "Who gets tired at 8 o'clock?" "Leave him be," Mom said softly. "It's been a big day of changes." Leo scraped his leftovers into the designated food waste bag and quickly rinsed his plate with water from their jug. The sooner he could get to his tent, the sooner he could check on Noko. His heart had been racing all evening, worried the creature might be scared or hungry. "Night, everyone," he called, already unzipping the tent he shared with his father. "I'll be in later," Dad replied. "Sleep well, kiddo." Inside the tent, Leo fumbled with his flashlight, positioning it to cast indirect light. He didn't want to startle Noko with anything too bright. His hands trembled slightly as he opened his duffel bag, peeling back the sweatshirt he'd used as a nest. Noko lay curled in a tight ball, pink skin almost glowing in the dim light. The creature's chest rose and fell in steady breaths, but the earlier chirping had stopped. Leo's throat tightened with worry. Was Noko sick? Scared? He needed to make the little creature more comfortable. Reaching into his bag, Leo pulled out one of his thick wool hiking socks, still clean and unused. He carefully shaped it into a small nest, creating soft folds for Noko to snuggle into. With gentle movements, he scooped up the creature and transferred it to the sock. "There you go," he whispered, watching as Noko shifted slightly in the new bedding. "That should be warmer." Leo quickly changed into his pajamas and slipped into his sleeping bag, bringing the sock nest with him. He positioned it near his chest where he could keep an eye on his tiny friend. The creature's bat-like ears twitched at every sound from outside. The crackle of the campfire, his family's muffled voices, an owl's distant call. "You must be hungry," Leo murmured, remembering he hadn't seen Noko eat anything all day. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a couple of crackers he'd saved from dinner. Breaking off a small piece, he placed the crumb next to Noko's head. The creature's large eyes focused on the offering, blinking slowly. Noko stretched out its neck to sniff the cracker, but seemed confused about what to do next. When it tried to nibble, its movements were uncertain, as if it had never encountered solid food before. "Here, let me help." Leo crushed the cracker between his fingers, creating a fine powder. He sprinkled it near Noko, watching as the creature's nose twitched with interest. This time, Noko extended a small tongue, pink like its skin, and began licking up the crumbs. Encouraged, Leo crushed more crackers, creating a little pile of powder. He also tried offering a tiny piece of beef jerky from his trail mix, but Noko turned away from the meat, returning to the cracker dust instead. As Noko ate, Leo noticed the creature's trembling had completely stopped. He carefully extended one finger toward his new friend, holding his breath. Noko paused in its snacking and looked at the offered digit. After a moment's consideration, the creature nudged Leo's finger with its head. The touch sent a wave of relief through Leo. Noko's skin was warm now, no longer the cool, clammy temperature from when he'd found it. "You're feeling better, aren't you?" Leo whispered. He began humming softly, a lullaby his mom used to sing when he was smaller. Noko's ears perked up, swiveling to catch the quiet tune. The creature's eyes began to droop, apparently soothed by the gentle sound. Leo continued humming, watching as Noko's breathing became slower and more regular. He kept his finger near the creature, amazed when it gradually leaned against him, seeming to seek out his warmth. The trust this tiny being placed in him made his chest feel tight with emotion. Outside, he could hear his family preparing for bed. Ava was complaining about having to brush her teeth with bottled water, while Mom reminded everyone to double-check the food storage. Leo carefully adjusted his position, making sure Noko's sock nest was secure and comfortable. As the night deepened, the sounds of the forest changed. Crickets chirped their evening symphony, accompanied by the occasional rustle of nocturnal creatures. Leo fought to keep his eyes open, not wanting to fall asleep in case Noko needed anything. But eventually, exhaustion won out, and he drifted off to the sound of soft, regular breathing from his small companion. He wasn't sure how long he'd been asleep when he felt a gentle movement near his chin. Through half-closed eyes, Leo watched as Noko carefully climbed out of the sock, its movements more confident than before. The creature paused, looking at Leo's face, then slowly made its way up toward his neck. Leo remained perfectly still as Noko settled into the warm space under his chin, curling up like a tiny cat. A sound emerged from the creature, not quite a purr, not quite a bird's trill, but something in between. The gentle vibration against his skin made Leo smile in his sleep. his hand instinctively moving to curl protectively around the now empty sock. The tent zipper made a quiet sound as Ava poked her head in, probably looking for her flashlight. In the pre-dawn dimness, she saw nothing unusual, just her little brother sleeping peacefully, one hand clutched around what looked like a sock. She shook her head slightly and withdrew, letting the tent flap fall closed behind her. Leo's fingers tightened slightly around the wool sock, his sleeping face wearing an expression of contentment and pride. Noko's unique purr trill continued softly, a private lullaby shared between boy and creature in the quiet morning hours. The morning sun filtered through the tent walls as the smell of pancakes wafted through the campsite. Leo kept his eyes closed, listening to the sizzle of the griddle and his family's voices outside. Noko was still curled against his neck, warm and breathing steadily. "Leo, breakfast!" Mom called, her voice cheerful. "Don't let these pancakes get cold." Leo carefully scooped Noko back into the wool sock and tucked it deep inside his sleeping bag. "Stay quiet," he whispered, heart racing as he unzipped the tent. The morning air was crisp, and dew sparkled on the grass. Dad stood at the portable griddle, expertly flipping golden brown pancakes while Mom arranged plates on their folding table. Ava sat hunched in her camp chair, picking at her sleeve with a scowl. "These mosquitoes are eating me alive," she complained, scratching her arm. "I counted 12 bites just on my left hand." "Here's the bug spray," Mom said, tossing her the bottle. "And remember to wear your long sleeves today. We're going hiking after breakfast." Leo slid into his chair, accepting a plate stacked with pancakes. He forced himself to eat slowly, though his mind kept drifting to Noko. Would the creature be okay alone in the tent? What did it usually eat for breakfast? "Everyone needs to carry their own water today," Dad announced, joining them at the table. "We'll follow the stream trail up to the ridge. Should take about 3 hours round trip." "3 hours?" Ava groaned. "In this heat?" Mom reached across the table and squeezed Ava's hand. "It'll be good for us. My doctor says regular exercise is important for recovery. And look, my latest checkup showed everything stable." A moment of quiet fell over the table. Leo watched his mother's face, noting how much more color she had compared to a few months ago. The dark circles under her eyes had faded, and her smile seemed more genuine. "Well," Dad said, clearing his throat, "let's get cleaned up and pack for the hike. Leo, you're on dish duty this morning." Leo hurried through washing the dishes, constantly glancing back at his tent. As soon as he finished, he ducked inside, relieved to find the sock nest undisturbed. Noko chirped softly when Leo checked on it. The family set out on their hike just before mid-morning. Leo wore his largest hoodie, the sock nest carefully hidden in his front pocket. The trail followed a clear stream that bubbled over rocks and fallen branches, the sound of running water mixed with birdsong and the crunch of leaves under their boots. After about an hour, they stopped at a wide spot near the stream where several fallen logs provided natural seating. While his parents consulted the trail map and Ava complained about cell phone withdrawal, Leo spotted a secluded patch of thick moss beneath a large oak tree. "I'm going to explore a little," he called out, trying to sound casual. "Stay where we can see you," Mom reminded him. Leo walked slowly to the mossy area, making sure no one was watching. He knelt down and carefully lifted Noko from his pocket. The creature blinked in the dappled sunlight, its pink skin almost translucent. "You can stretch here," Leo whispered, setting Noko on the soft moss. "No one can see us." Noko stood shakily, extending its small limbs one at a time. Leo noticed webbing between its toes for the first time, delicate and pale, like tissue paper. The creature's nose was dry but velvety, reminding him of a piglet's snout. When he looked closer, he could see a tiny tail, barely longer than his thumbnail. Leo pulled out his notebook and pencil, quickly sketching Noko's features. The creature watched him intently, tilting its head to match Leo's movements. When Leo smiled, Noko's mouth curved upward in an eerily similar expression. "Can you copy everything I do?" Leo whispered, fascinated. He stuck out his tongue, and Noko's small pink tongue emerged in response. When it was time to move on, Leo didn't need to pick Noko up. The creature followed him naturally, hopping in an awkward but determined way. It never ran, maintaining a steady pace just behind Leo's feet. The rest of the hike passed without incident, though Leo had to frequently slow his pace to let Noko catch up. They returned to camp in the late afternoon, everyone tired and ready for rest. Leo sat in his camp chair, Noko safely tucked in his hoodie pocket. "What's that moving in your pocket?" Ava asked suddenly, her eyes narrowing as she noticed the subtle shifting beneath the fabric. Leo's heart jumped. "Nothing," he said quickly. "Just fidgeting." Ava didn't look convinced, but Mom called her to help with dinner preparation before she could press further. The evening meal was simple: baked potatoes and hot dogs cooked over the fire. Leo carefully mashed a tiny portion of his potato, waiting until everyone was distracted by Dad's camping stories to slip it into his pocket. He added a small piece of apple from dessert as well. Later, inside his tent, Leo watched with satisfaction as Noko eagerly ate the offered food. The creature seemed to especially enjoy the apple, making soft chirping sounds between bites. Leo noticed how Noko responded to his voice now, turning its head whenever he spoke and answering with gentle chirps. When the camp settled into nighttime quiet, Leo slipped out of his tent with Noko cupped carefully in his hands. He sat in his chair, gazing up at the star-filled sky. The creature in his palms felt warm and trusting, its webbed feet pressing gently against his skin. "I don't think you're a puppy at all," Leo whispered, studying Noko's unique features in the starlight. Gray clouds hung low over the campsite as morning crept in, bringing with it a damp chill that had everyone pulling their jackets closer. The night's temperature drop had left sleeping bags slightly wet with condensation, and tempers were short around the breakfast table. Dad burned the oatmeal, scraping black bits from the bottom of the pot with a grimace. Mom tried to salvage it with extra brown sugar, but Ava just pushed her portion around with her spoon, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she'd barely slept. Leo sat hunched in his chair, one hand pressed against his hoodie pocket where Noko nestled, warm against the morning chill. The creature had been restless during the night, and Leo worried its chirps might have carried through the tent walls. "We're running low on water," Mom announced, checking their supplies with a frown. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, her face tired but determined. "Ava, Leo, take the jugs down to the river and fill them up. Remember to use the purification tablets." "Why can't Dad do it?" Ava muttered, but there was less bite in her voice than usual when she caught Mom's expression. Leo's stomach tightened. He couldn't leave Noko behind. What if it made noise while he was gone? But taking it along meant risking discovery. After a moment's hesitation, he carefully zipped his hoodie pocket halfway, creating a secure space for the creature. "Come on," Ava said, already heading toward the trail with 2 empty water jugs swinging from her hands. "Let's get this over with." Leo grabbed the remaining jugs and hurried after her, trying to walk smoothly, to avoid jostling his pocket. The trail to the river was narrow and steep in places, requiring careful footwork over exposed roots and loose stones. The siblings walked in silence, their boots crunching on fallen leaves. Halfway down the trail, where the path curved sharply around a large boulder, Noko suddenly let out a clear, bright chirp. The sound seemed to echo in the quiet forest. Ava stopped dead in her tracks. "What was that?" "What was what?" Leo tried to sound casual, but his voice cracked. Another chirp, and this time Leo's pocket visibly moved. Ava's eyes locked onto the motion, and before Leo could step back, she lunged forward. Her hand shot out, quick as a snake, and grabbed at his pocket. "No, wait," Leo started, but it was too late. Noko tumbled out into Ava's hands, blinking up at her with its large, watery eyes. Its ears twitched, and it made a soft, questioning sound. Ava's mouth fell open. She didn't scream or drop Noko. Instead, she stared at the creature with pure amazement. "What is that?" she whispered. Her eyes traveled over Noko's peculiar features: the pink skin, the bat-like ears, the tiny webbed feet. "That's not a dog. That's something else." "Please don't tell Mom and Dad," Leo blurted out, his heart hammering. "Please, Ava. They'll make me get rid of it." Ava didn't respond immediately. She was still studying Noko, turning her hands gently to examine it from different angles. Leo noticed something strange. Despite her usual allergic reactions to animals, Ava wasn't showing any symptoms. No sneezing, no watery eyes, no red patches on her hands where Noko's skin touched hers. "Where did you find it?" she finally asked, her voice softer than Leo had heard it in months. "In the leaves, that first day. It was alone and scared." Leo stepped closer, relieved that Ava was holding Noko carefully. "I couldn't just leave it." Ava's usual skeptical expression had melted into something more open, more curious. "Let's sit down," she said, nodding toward a flat rock near the river's edge. "I want to look at it properly." They made their way to the rock, setting the water jugs aside. The river burbled peacefully beside them as they sat, Noko still cradled in Ava's hands. The creature seemed calm, looking between the siblings with interest. "Watch this," Leo said, reaching out to set Noko on the smooth stone surface between them. He picked up a small pebble and rolled it between his fingers. Noko immediately focused on the movement, then picked up a tiny pebble of its own. Its delicate fingers mimicked Leo's motion perfectly, down to the slight tilt of its head. "That's incredible," Ava breathed. "It's copying you." She held out her hand, and Noko dropped its pebble to watch her intently. "Can it?" She wiggled her fingers in a small wave. Noko's face scrunched in concentration, and then its hand rose in an exact copy of Ava's wave. A smile broke across Ava's face, a real smile, the kind Leo hadn't seen since before Mom got sick. "It's smart," Leo said, feeling a surge of pride. "And it likes water. See the webbed feet. But it doesn't swim exactly. More like hops around in the shallow parts." Ava leaned forward, her scientific curiosity fully engaged. "What else have you noticed? What does it eat?" "No meat," Leo reported. "It likes soft things, mashed potatoes, apple pieces, crackers crushed up really small. And it always stays close to me, follows me everywhere." They sat together, sharing observations as Noko explored the rock's surface, occasionally returning to touch one of their hands as if checking in. The creature seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere between the siblings, chirping happily as it moved between them. Leo watched his sister's face as she tracked Noko's movements. The hard shell she'd built around herself over the past month seemed to have cracked, letting something warmer shine through. When Noko copied her finger-tapping pattern perfectly, Ava actually laughed, a sound Leo had almost forgotten. She turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Whatever he is," she said quietly, "he trusts you." The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows over the campsite as Leo and Ava huddled behind their tent, heads bent together in concentration. They had spread Leo's sleeping bag on a patch of dry ground, carefully arranging their gathered supplies around them. "Here," Ava whispered, passing Leo a handful of soft, dry moss she'd collected from the shaded side of a fallen log. "This should work better than the sock." Leo nodded, accepting the moss and arranging it inside an empty water bottle he'd cut in half lengthwise. The plastic formed a perfect curved shelter, just the right size for Noko to nestle into. "It needs something softer at the bottom," he murmured, frowning at the makeshift bed. Ava's eyes lit up. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small wad of cotton she'd snuck from the first aid kit. "Mom always packs extra," she explained, carefully teasing the cotton apart into a fluffy layer. Together, they lined the plastic shelter with the cotton, creating a cozy nest that fit perfectly inside Leo's sleeping bag. Noko watched their work with intense interest from its temporary hiding spot in Leo's hoodie pocket, occasionally poking its head out to chirp softly. "Okay, little guy," Leo said, gently lifting Noko from his pocket. "Try this." The creature sniffed at its new home, ears twitching as it explored the soft materials. After a careful inspection, Noko settled into the nest with a contented chirp, its large eyes blinking slowly. "Look!" Ava pointed excitedly as Noko suddenly hopped up, moving with more energy than they'd seen before. The creature bounced from the nest to Leo's knee, then to the sleeping bag, its movements becoming more confident and playful. Leo laughed quietly, holding out his hand. Noko immediately focused on him, copying his smile in its own peculiar way. "Watch this," Leo whispered to Ava. He raised his finger and made a spinning motion. Noko's head tilted, studying the movement. Then, with determined concentration, it attempted to spin in place. The result was more of a wobbly hop, but the intent was clear. "That's amazing," Ava breathed, pulling Leo's sketchbook closer. She flipped to a blank page and began jotting notes. "Try something else." Leo raised both hands and wiggled his fingers. Before he could even complete the motion, Noko was already moving, its tiny hands rising in anticipation of the gesture. Ava frowned, tapping her pencil against the page. "Did you see that? He started moving before you finished the motion." She leaned forward, studying Noko more closely. "It's like he knew what you were going to do." "Maybe it was just a lucky guess," Leo suggested, but he looked uncertain. "Let's test it," Ava said, her scientific curiosity fully engaged. She nodded to Leo. "Pretend to sneeze." Leo scrunched up his face, preparing for an exaggerated achoo. But before he could make a sound, Noko had already jumped, its ears flattened against its head in preparation for the loud noise that hadn't come yet. "See?" Ava said triumphantly. "He's not just copying, he's anticipating." She began writing rapidly in the sketchbook, her earlier reluctance completely forgotten. "What else have you noticed about him?" They spent the next hour observing and documenting everything they could about their unusual friend. Leo demonstrated how Noko refused bits of beef jerky, but eagerly accepted soft foods. Ava noted how the creature's tongue felt like velvet when it licked dropped crumbs from her palm. "Look at his eyes," Leo pointed out as he smiled at Noko. The creature's pupils expanded visibly, matching Leo's expression of happiness. "And the ears," Ava added, watching them swivel precisely toward every small sound. "They moved like radar dishes." She wrote everything down, her neat handwriting filling the page with observations. As they continued their study, Ava's expression grew more serious. "Leo," she said slowly, "I don't think this is normal, even for whatever kind of animal he might be. The way he learns, how fast he picks things up." She gestured at Noko, who was now perfectly mimicking her pencil-tapping rhythm. "This isn't just animal intelligence. This is something else." Before Leo could respond, their mother's voice carried across the campsite. "Kids, dinner time!" They quickly helped Noko back into Leo's hoodie pocket, where the creature had learned to stay still and quiet. The family gathered around the campfire, where Dad was serving up grilled vegetables on their camping plates. The smell of roasted peppers and zucchini filled the air, as they settled into their chairs. Mom passed around the salt, commenting on how the fresh air had improved her appetite. Leo picked at his food carefully, trying not to move too suddenly and disturb Noko. Ava sat beside him, occasionally glancing at his pocket with worried eyes. The meal progressed peacefully until Noko, perhaps smelling the food, let out a tiny chirp. Dad paused mid-bite, his fork hovering in the air as his eyes narrowed slightly. Did anyone hear that? Leo immediately forced out a loud cough, drowning out any possibility of hearing another chirp. He thumped his chest for good measure, eyes watering from the effort. Speaking of hearing things, Ava jumped in smoothly. Mom, how's that new medication working? You said something about side effects? Mom launched into an explanation of her new treatment plan, and Dad's attention shifted away from the mysterious sound. Under the cover of conversation, Leo felt Noko settle more deeply into his pocket, becoming completely still. As their parents discussed medical details, Leo and Ava exchanged a worried look across their plates. They both knew they'd come close to discovery, and they'd need to be more careful. Later, as the family prepared for bed, Leo carefully transferred Noko to its new nest. The creature curled up contentedly beside Leo's sketchbook, which lay open to their page of observations. In Ava's careful handwriting, one line stood out among the notes. He learns fast. A thick blanket of fog draped over the campsite as morning crept in, turning familiar shapes into ghostly silhouettes. Leo zipped up his backpack with extra care, making sure the small nest of cotton and moss was secure inside. Noko chirped softly as Leo adjusted the padding around him. You'll have to be extra quiet today, Leo whispered, gently patting the side of his backpack. Promise? Noko responded with the tiniest of squeaks, as if understanding the need for discretion. Outside the tent, Dad was already going through his hiking checklist, marking items off on his fingers while Mom sat in her camping chair, wrapped in a thick blanket despite the mild temperature. Her face looked tired, but she managed a warm smile as Leo emerged from the tent. I think I'll sit this one out, she said, catching Dad's concerned glance. Just need to recharge a bit. You three go ahead and enjoy the view from the lookout. Ava appeared from her tent, hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her usual skeptical expression firmly in place. She had her own backpack slung over one shoulder, filled with water bottles and trail mix that Mom had insisted they bring. It's about a 2-hour hike to the lookout, Dad announced, consulting his trail map. We should be back well before dinner time. He folded the map carefully and tucked it into his pocket. Everyone ready? Leo nodded, adjusting his backpack straps while trying not to jostle its precious cargo too much. Ava merely shrugged, already starting down the trail ahead of them. The fog began to lift as they climbed higher, revealing glimpses of the valley below through breaks in the trees. The trail wound steadily upward, switching back and forth across the mountainside. Dad led the way, occasionally pointing out interesting plants or bird calls. His enthusiasm met with varying levels of response from his children. Leo kept pace in the middle, carefully watching his footing on the rocky path while monitoring the subtle movements in his backpack. Every now and then, he felt Noko shift position, but true to its promise, the creature remained silent. Ava brought up the rear, her footsteps steady but deliberately unhurried. She maintained enough distance to avoid conversation, but stayed close enough to keep an eye on Leo's backpack. When they finally reached the lookout point, the fog had completely burned away, revealing a spectacular view of the surrounding wilderness. Dad pulled out his water bottle and settled on a flat rock, patting the spaces beside him invitingly. Come on, kids, let's take a break, he said, his voice carrying a forced casualness that made Ava roll her eyes. Ava, how's school going? You haven't said much about it lately. It's fine, Ava replied flatly, choosing to sit on a separate rock just out of comfortable talking distance. She pulled out her water bottle and took a long drink, clearly signaling her disinterest in conversation. Leo settled down cross-legged on the ground, pulling out his sketchbook. He positioned himself so his backpack was partially hidden behind him, allowing him to peek inside occasionally while pretending to sketch the landscape. Dad watched them both, his expression a mixture of concern and resignation. His eyes lingered on Leo's careful movements, noting how the boy kept his backpack unusually close. Leo felt his father's attention and hunched further over his sketchbook, adding random tree shapes to mask his real subject of study, Noko's distinctive ear shapes and the way they twitched in response to sounds. "I'm going to get some photos while the view is clear," Dad finally announced, standing up and pulling out his camera. He walked to the edge of the lookout point, adjusting his lens and focusing on the distant mountains. As soon as Dad's back was turned, Ava slid off her rock and moved closer to Leo. "Come on," she whispered, nodding toward a large boulder off to the side of the lookout. "While he's distracted." They quietly made their way behind the boulder, which effectively blocked them from view. Leo carefully opened his backpack, and Noko immediately poked its head out, blinking in the bright sunlight. "Go ahead," Leo encouraged softly, "but stay close." Noko hopped out onto a patch of moss, stretching its tiny limbs after being confined in the backpack. Its movements were more confident now, each leap precise and controlled. As they watched, a bird called from a nearby tree, a simple three-note song. Noko's ears swiveled toward the sound, and to their amazement, it opened its mouth and produced an almost perfect copy of the bird's call. "That's new," Ava whispered, her eyes wide. She reached into her own backpack and pulled out a small notebook. "We need to document everything properly, like real scientists." She opened the notebook to its first blank page and wrote in careful letters, "Noko, Observation Log Number 1. Below the title, she began listing their observations, starting with the date and time. "Write down everything you've noticed," she instructed Leo, passing him the notebook. "Even things that seem ordinary. We need to establish patterns." Leo took the notebook, thinking carefully before writing. Mimics sounds perfectly after hearing them once. Started with simple noises, now can copy complex patterns, bird songs. They spent several minutes trading the notebook back and forth, recording their observations while Noko explored the small area behind the boulder, occasionally returning to check on them as if making sure they were still there. "Kids?" Dad's voice called out. "Where did you go?" They quickly helped Noko back into the backpack, making sure it was comfortable before zipping it up. "Just looking at some interesting rocks, Dad," Ava called back, leading the way around the boulder with casual innocence. The hike back to camp was easier, mostly downhill, but they maintained their careful formation. Dad in front, Leo in the middle protecting his backpack, and Ava bringing up the rear. When they finally reached camp, Mom was looking more refreshed, having napped in her chair with a book in her lap. Later that evening, after dinner was cleaned up and their parents were engaged in conversation by the campfire, Leo and Ava retreated to their tent with flashlights and their secret log. They lay on their stomachs, heads close together as they reviewed their notes, while Noko explored the tent's interior with curious hops. "Look at this," Ava said, flipping to a new page in the notebook. She began sketching, her strokes careful and deliberate. Leo watched in surprise as a detailed drawing of Noko took shape on the paper, right next to his own earlier sketches. "I didn't know you could draw," he said, studying her work. She'd captured Noko's unique features perfectly. The large, expressive eyes, the radar dish ears, the tiny webbed feet. "There's a lot you don't know about me," Ava replied, adding final touches to the sketch. She looked at Noko, who had paused to watch them with its head tilted. "You know, I've been thinking, maybe you didn't just find him," she said softly. Maybe he found you. The next morning brought welcome warmth, the sun burning away the last traces of the previous day's chill. Everyone seemed to move with renewed energy around the campsite. Mom hummed while making breakfast. Dad whistled as he organized his camera gear, and even Ava emerged from her tent without her usual scowl. "Perfect day for some family photos," Dad announced, holding up his professional camera with enthusiasm. "There's a beautiful spot by the lake I spotted yesterday. Great lighting this time of day." Leo's stomach tightened as he absently stroked the small lump in his hoodie pocket where Noko was nestled. He glanced at Ava, hoping she'd want to join them, but she was already shaking her head. "Actually, I've got a bit of a headache," Ava said, pressing her fingers to her temples for effect. "Think I might just stay here and rest." She shot Leo an apologetic look when their parents weren't watching. "You sure, honey?" Mom asked, reaching out to feel Ava's forehead. "You don't feel warm." "Just need some quiet time," Ava insisted, already retreating to her tent. "You guys go ahead." Leo watched her disappear into the tent, feeling suddenly vulnerable. He'd grown used to having Ava as backup, someone to help distract their parents when Noko made an unexpected sound or movement. Now he'd have to manage alone. The walk to the lake took about 15 minutes, with Dad leading the way and pointing out various plants and birds to Mom, who nodded politely but seemed more interested in the book tucked under her arm. Leo trailed behind them, one hand constantly near his pocket, ready to muffle any sounds Noko might make. The lake sparkled under the late morning sun, its surface broken only by the occasional jump of a fish or landing of a water bird. Dad was right about the spot. A small clearing opened up to a perfect view of the water, with old-growth trees framing the scene like a natural picture frame. "Clara, why don't you get comfortable on that bench while I set up?" Dad suggested, already unpacking his tripod. "Leo, come help me find the right angle." Mom settled onto a weathered wooden bench, opening her book with visible relief. Leo moved carefully toward his father, trying to keep his movements smooth to avoid disturbing Noko. Dad spent several minutes adjusting the camera settings and positioning the tripod, explaining each step to Leo as if he were genuinely interested. Under normal circumstances, Leo might have been. His father's passion for photography had always been infectious. But right now, all he could think about was keeping Noko hidden. "Let's take a quick break before we start the actual shoot," Dad said, wiping his brow. "Getting pretty warm out here." Leo nodded, spotting an opportunity to move away from his father's watchful eye. "I'll just refill my water bottle," he said, pulling it from his backpack. He knelt by the lake's edge, carefully unscrewing the cap. The water was crystal clear, and he could see small fish darting just beneath the surface. The sight must have interested Noko too, because Leo felt movement in his pocket. Before he could stop it, a soft chirp escaped from his hoodie. The sound, though quiet, seemed to echo across the still lake surface. "Was that a bird?" Dad's voice came from right behind him, making Leo jump. Yeah, Leo stammered, trying to stand up, but his father was already kneeling beside him. "Just a small one, I think." Before Leo could react, Dad reached out and lifted the flap of his hoodie pocket. Time seemed to freeze as his father's eyes widened, taking in the sight of Noko, who had poked its head out to investigate the water. Dad's expression transformed instantly. The casual curiosity vanished, replaced by something more complex. Concern, recognition, and what looked like professional interest all mixed together. With surprisingly gentle movements, he reached into Leo's pocket and carefully lifted Noko out. "Leo." Dad's voice was quiet but serious, taking on a tone Leo had never heard before. "This is not a dog. This is not a pet." He held Noko up to eye level, examining it with the practiced gaze of someone who knew exactly what to look for. Leo's heart pounded as he watched his father study Noko, who remained surprisingly calm in his hands. The creature even tilted its head, meeting Dad's gaze with what seemed like equal curiosity. "We need to head back to camp," Dad said finally, carefully returning Noko to Leo's pocket. "Your sister needs to be part of this conversation." The walk back was tense and silent. Mom, sensing something was wrong but not knowing what, followed behind them with worried glances. As soon as they reached camp, Leo rushed to find Ava, leaving their parents talking in hushed tones by the fire pit. He found her in her tent, actually reading a book this time. Her expression darkened as soon as she saw his face. "What happened?" she demanded, sitting up straight. Leo told her everything about the lake, the chirp, and Dad's discovery. With each detail, Ava's face grew stormier. "I knew I shouldn't have let you go alone," she said, running her hands through her hair in frustration. "We were doing so well, keeping him secret." Before they could discuss it further, Dad's voice called from outside. "Leo? Ava? Can you both come to the main tent, please?" They exchanged worried looks before making their way to where their father waited. Inside the tent, Dad sat cross-legged, his expression serious but not angry. He waited until they were both seated before speaking. "There's something I need to tell you both," he began, his voice carrying the weight of professional authority. "Before I switched careers to help take care of your mom, I was a wildlife biologist. I spent years studying and documenting various species, some of them previously unknown to science." He paused, looking directly at Noko, who was now sitting calmly in Leo's lap. "But in all my years of research, I've never seen anything like this creature. Not even close." Leo and Ava exchanged glances as their father leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. "If he's what I think he is, he shouldn't be here. Not with us." Thunder rumbled in the distance as the family huddled inside the main tent, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of a battery-powered lantern. The wind had picked up considerably, making the tent walls flutter and snap. Leo sat cross-legged with Noko, wrapped securely in his favorite sweater, while Ava perched protectively beside them. Dad adjusted the lantern, casting shadows that danced across the tent's ceiling. His expression was thoughtful, almost hesitant, as if weighing each word before speaking. "There's something you both need to know," he began, his voice barely audible above the growing storm. "Something that happened about 10 years ago, before either of you were old enough to remember." Leo felt Noko stir against his chest, responding to the tension in his voice. Ava leaned forward slightly, her usual skepticism replaced by genuine curiosity. "Northeast of this reserve, maybe 30 miles from here, there used to be a research facility," Dad continued, running a hand through his graying hair. "It wasn't the kind you'd find at universities or government labs. This was different, private, secret." A gust of wind rattled the tent poles, making them all jump slightly. Dad waited for the noise to settle before continuing. "At first, there were just whispers among the scientific community. Rumors about breakthrough genetic research, something about combining DNA from different species in ways that hadn't been done before. Most of us dismissed it as gossip." He paused, glancing at Noko. "We were wrong." Leo's arms tightened instinctively around the small creature. Noko responded by nuzzling closer, its soft chirps muffled by the sweater. "The facility was conducting illegal biobreeding experiments," Dad explained, his professional tone taking over. "They were attempting to create hybrid species, combining traits from various exotic animals. The goal was to develop creatures with enhanced abilities, improved intelligence, advanced adaptation capabilities, accelerated learning." Ava's eyes widened. "Like how Noko copies everything he sees." Dad nodded grimly. "Exactly like that. When authorities finally investigated, they found evidence of genetic splicing experiments, but most of the research had been destroyed. The scientists had fled, and according to official reports, none of their creations survived. The wind howled outside, and rain began to patter against the tent's roof. Dad reached for his camera bag, pulling out an old SD card from a hidden pocket. "I kept this from my research days," he said, inserting the card into his camera. "I never showed it to anyone because I couldn't explain what I'd seen. I thought maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me." He turned the camera's display toward them. The image was slightly grainy but clear enough. A creature unmistakably similar to Noko, but larger, perhaps the size of a house cat. It had the same distinctive ears, the same otherworldly eyes, though its coloring was slightly different. The photo showed it perched on a fallen log, looking directly at the camera with an intelligence that seemed almost human. "I took this photo 8 years ago during a wildlife survey," Dad explained. "It was just for a second. The creature disappeared before I could get a better shot. I never saw it again, and nobody believed me when I described it." Leo stared at the photo, then down at Noko, who had poked its head out of the sweater to look at the camera's screen. The creature's ears twitched with interest, and it tilted its head in a way that seemed almost like recognition. "So Noko," Ava started, her voice unusually quiet. "He's from that lab? He's one of their experiments?" "He must be," Dad replied. "There's no other explanation for a creature like this. The genetic markers are too specific. The adaptability, the mimicry, the accelerated learning. He's exactly what they were trying to create." Lightning flashed outside, briefly illuminating the entire tent. Leo felt Noko tremble in his arms, but not from cold. The creature pressed closer to his chest, seeking comfort. "But he's not a mistake," Ava said firmly, surprising everyone with the emotion in her voice. "Look at him, Dad. He's not some failed experiment. He's just lost." She reached out to stroke Noko's head, and the creature leaned into her touch. "He found Leo because he needed help." Dad's expression softened as he watched the interaction. The scientist in him seemed to battle with the father, and the father won. He sighed deeply, shoulders relaxing. "You're right," he admitted. "Whatever his origins, he's clearly a sensitive, intelligent being." He leaned back, considering their situation. "I won't report this, not yet. But you both need to understand something. We can't keep him forever." "Why not?" Leo spoke for the first time, his voice small but determined. "Because he needs proper care, Leo. Specialized attention, and because keeping him hidden could be dangerous, for him and for us." Dad held up a hand to stop their protest. "But we can do this carefully. I propose sending an anonymous inquiry to the park rangers just to gather information. We won't mention Noko specifically, just ask about unusual wildlife sightings in the area. It might help us understand where he came from and what he needs." Another crack of thunder shook the tent, closer this time. The storm was directly overhead now, rain drumming against the canvas in sheets. Noko shivered in Leo's arms, each flash of lightning making him burrow deeper into the sweater. "He's scared," Leo whispered, cradling the trembling creature closer. "It's okay," Ava said, moving closer to shield them both. "We won't let anything happen to him." Dad watched them with a mixture of pride and concern. "We'll figure this out together," he promised. "But for now, let's all try to get some sleep. We can talk more in the morning." As their father moved to leave the tent, another powerful gust of wind made the whole structure shake. Lightning split the sky, and thunder crashed almost simultaneously. Noko whimpered, a sound so human-like it made everyone pause. Leo bent his head close to the frightened creature, his voice barely a whisper, but fierce with protection. I won't let them take you. I promise. The morning sun struggled through a haze of lingering clouds, casting weak shadows across the campsite. Everything was damp from the previous night's storm. Fallen branches scattered like pickup sticks around their clearing, tent fabric sagging with collected moisture, and the air heavy with the rich smell of wet earth. Leo sat on a fallen log, his blue hoodie zipped up to his chin despite the humid morning. Inside, Noko slept peacefully against his chest, occasionally making tiny chirping sounds that Leo disguised with well-timed coughs. He watched as Mom and Ava worked together, spreading out wet sleeping bags and tarps to dry in whatever patches of sunlight broke through the canopy. Dad moved methodically around their campsite, checking guy lines and assessing damage to the tents. His movements were precise but distracted, his attention divided between the tasks at hand and frequent glances at the satellite phone clipped to his belt. When it finally rang, the sharp electronic tone made everyone jump. Leo watched his father's face as he answered, noting how his expression shifted from polite to concerned in a matter of seconds. "Yes, we weathered it fine," Dad said into the phone, his voice carefully neutral. "Some branches down, but nothing serious." He paused, listening. "A ranger check-in? Today?" His eyes flickered briefly to Leo before he continued. "Of course, we understand. Safety first." When he hung up, the silence felt heavier than before. "The ranger station is sending someone up to check on campers after the storm," he announced, but his tone carried an edge of unease that made Leo hold Noko closer. The morning crawled into afternoon, sun finally winning its battle with the clouds. Leo and Ava had just finished helping Mom organize their food supplies when the crunch of boots on wet leaves announced their visitor. Ranger Collis appeared at the edge of their campsite, his khaki jacket crisp despite the humid air, dark green ranger hat set at a precise angle on his head. "Afternoon, folks," he called out, his smile wide and practiced. He looked to be in his mid-40s, with neat salt and pepper hair and alert eyes that seemed to catalog everything they fell upon. "Just doing my rounds after that nasty storm. Everything holding up okay here?" Dad stepped forward, extending his hand. "We're managing fine, thank you. Just some minor cleanup needed." Ranger Collis nodded, but his gaze was already moving past Dad, scanning their equipment with what seemed like more than casual interest. His eyes lingered on the tents, the arrangement of their gear, the way everything was laid out. "Good to hear," he said, still smiling. "Been seeing all sorts of interesting things out here lately. Any unusual tracks around your site? Animals behaving strangely?" Leo felt Noko stir inside his hoodie and pressed his hand gently against the fabric, willing the creature to stay still. Beside him, Ava shifted slightly, positioning herself between Leo and the ranger's line of sight. "Nothing unusual," Mom answered, her voice warm but firm. "Just the typical forest creatures." "Ah, well, always good to keep an eye out," Collis replied, his attention now fixed on Leo, specifically on the way Leo's hands remained protectively crossed over his middle. The ranger's smile widened as he approached, crouching down to Leo's eye level. "Say, young man, what have you got there? Looks like you might be hiding a little critter in that jacket." Leo felt his heart hammering against his ribs, probably loud enough for Noko to feel it. Before he could stammer out a response, Dad stepped smoothly between them. "Leo's been fighting off a bit of a cold," Dad said, his tone light but carrying an unmistakable note of authority. "The damp weather isn't helping much. Say, Ranger Collis, I noticed quite a few fallen branches on the trail heading east. Might want to check those out before someone trips." The ranger straightened slowly, his smile never wavering. "Appreciate the heads up. I'll take a look at that right away." He tipped his hat to Mom. "Ma'am, kids." With a final sweeping glance around the campsite, he turned and disappeared back into the trees, his footsteps fading into the forest sounds. The family maintained their casual positions until they were certain he was gone. Then Dad quickly gathered them all inside the main tent, his movements urgent but controlled. "I need to tell you something," he said in a low voice, running a hand through his hair. "I did send an anonymous message last night. Just basic questions about unusual wildlife sightings in the area. Nothing specific about Noko." He pulled out his satellite phone, frowning at the screen. "But I just checked with the ranger station. They didn't dispatch anyone today. No one named Collis is registered with them." Leo clutched Noko tighter through his hoodie, feeling the creature respond to his anxiety with a gentle nuzzle. Ava's face had gone pale, but her jaw was set in determination. "Then who is he?" she whispered. Dad shook his head slowly. "I don't know, but whoever he is, he's not here by accident." Beyond their tent, beyond the dying embers of their campfire, the forest had grown unusually quiet. And in the gathering shadows between the trees, Ranger Collis stood motionless, watching the family's tent with unblinking focus, his friendly demeanor replaced by something far more calculating. Leo jolted awake in the pre-dawn darkness, his hand instinctively reaching for the familiar warmth inside his hoodie. His fingers found only empty fabric. Heart racing, he patted the sleeping bag around him, then scrambled to check the makeshift nest they'd built for Noko. Nothing. No, he whispered, his voice trembling. The first gray light of morning was barely seeping through the tent walls as he lunged across the space, shaking Ava's shoulder. "Ava, wake up! Noko's gone!" Ava stirred, confusion quickly giving way to alarm as she registered Leo's panic. "What do you mean, gone? He's not here." "He's not anywhere." Leo's voice cracked, drawing their father from his own fitful sleep in the adjacent section of the tent. Dad sat up immediately, already reaching for his boots. "When did you last have him?" "When I went to sleep," Leo said, fighting back tears. "He was right here, in my hoodie pocket. I made sure it was zipped." They tore through the tent methodically, but frantically. Sleeping bags were unrolled and shaken out. Backpacks were emptied. Every corner was searched, every possible hiding spot investigated. With each passing minute, Leo's breathing grew more ragged. "We have to look outside," Ava said, already pulling on her jacket. "He might have found a way out." Dad nodded, pressing a finger to his lips and gesturing toward Mom's sleeping form. They slipped out of the tent as quietly as possible, the damp morning air clinging to their skin. The forest around them was still caught between night and day, shadows stretching long and dark between the trees. Dad pulled out his flashlight, sweeping the beam in wide arcs across the ground, while Leo and Ava searched the immediate campsite. "Look for any signs of disturbance," Dad whispered, his voice tight with concern. "Broken twigs, disturbed leaves, anything unusual." They worked in expanding circles around the camp, careful to stay within sight of each other. Leo's hands trembled as he pushed aside branches and peered under fallen logs. Ava methodically checked every bush and hollow she could find, her scientist's mind working even through her worry. The sun had risen enough to paint the treetops in gold when Ava suddenly froze, holding up her hand for silence. "Wait," she breathed. "Listen." They all stood perfectly still. For a moment, there was nothing but the normal morning chorus of birds and rustling leaves. Then, faint but unmistakable, a high-pitched chirp carried on the air from the direction of the river. "Noko!" Leo started forward, but Dad caught his arm. "Together," he said firmly. "Stay close." They moved as quickly as they dared through the underbrush, following the sound. As they approached the riverbank, Dad suddenly thrust out an arm, stopping both children in their tracks. His expression had turned hard, focused. There, partially concealed beneath carefully arranged brush, sat a small wire cage. Inside, Noko huddled in one corner, his large eyes wide with fear. When he saw Leo, he let out another desperate chirp. "Don't touch anything," Dad ordered, dropping to his knees to examine the setup. His eyes narrowed as he studied the ground around the cage. "These footprints, they're from enforcement-grade boots, standard issue for government personnel." Leo's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Ranger Collis?" "If that's even his real name." Dad carefully began disabling the trap's mechanism, his movements precise and controlled. "This is professional equipment, not something your average park ranger carries around." Once the cage was safely opened, Noko practically launched himself into Leo's waiting arms, burrowing deep into the boy's shirt. Leo held him close, feeling the rapid flutter of the creature's heartbeat gradually slow as he stroked its head. "He's okay," Ava said, gently checking Noko for any injuries. "He's scared, but they didn't hurt him." "Dad," she called suddenly, her voice sharp. She was crouched a few feet away, pointing at something in the leaves. "Look at this." Dad moved to her side, carefully picking up what looked like a tiny dart with his handkerchief. His face grew grimmer as he examined it. Tranquilizer dart, unused. He looked up at the kids, his expression grave. "Which means whoever set this trap plans to come back and finish the job." "Collis," Leo whispered, holding Noko tighter. "He's not a ranger," Dad confirmed, carefully wrapping the dart and tucking it away as evidence. "This is government-grade equipment. He's probably some kind of contractor, someone sent to investigate those old rumors about the genetic experiments." They made their way back to camp as quickly as possible, finding Mom already awake and worried by their absence. The moment she saw their faces, she knew something was wrong. "Clara," Dad said softly, "we need to tell you everything." They gathered in the main tent, and for the first time since finding Noko, the whole story came out. Mom listened silently, her eyes growing wider as Dad explained about the old laboratory, the genetic experiments, and the mysterious Ranger Collis. When Leo finally unzipped his hoodie to show her Noko, her hand flew to her mouth. "Oh," she breathed, watching as Noko cautiously sniffed in her direction. "Oh, you poor little thing." "We have to decide what to do," Dad said quietly. "All of us, as a family." They sat in a circle, Noko curled in Leo's lap, and held their first proper family vote in months. Mom's eyes were bright with tears as she cast her vote, but her voice was steady. "We can't keep him unprotected," she said softly. "Not with people like this Collis hunting him. It wouldn't be fair to Noko." Dad nodded, pulling out his notebook. "I have an idea," he said, sketching quickly. "We could build him a natural enclosure deeper in the reserve where people rarely go. Something camouflaged, hidden from casual observation. We could outfit it with cameras and motion sensors. I still have contacts who could help us get the equipment quietly." "Like a secret sanctuary?" Ava asked, leaning forward to study the sketch. "Exactly. Somewhere he can live safely, with room to grow and explore, but protected from those who would harm him." Leo's hand tightened on Noko's fur. "But we'd have to leave him there." Dad reached out, squeezing Leo's shoulder. "He can't be ours," he said gently, "but we can be his guardians." The morning sun had barely crept over the horizon when the family began their preparations. Dad's backpack was loaded with supplies while Ava double-checked the motion sensors and camera equipment. Leo carefully packed extra fruit and Noko's favorite moss-lined cloth into his own bag, his movements slow and deliberate. Noko watched from his perch on Leo's shoulder, ears twitching at every sound. He seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, staying unusually still as the family gathered their gear. "Ready?" Dad asked softly, adjusting the straps of his pack. Leo nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Ava gave his hand a quick squeeze as they set out, leaving Mom to watch over the camp. Dad and Ava took the lead, moving carefully through the undergrowth. They'd spent the early hours scouting several locations, finally settling on a secluded glade that met all their requirements, close to water, naturally sheltered, and far enough from any marked trails to avoid casual discovery. The hike took 20 minutes, with Dad frequently checking their surroundings for signs of other people. The glade, when they reached it, opened up like a secret garden. A small stream trickled along one edge, creating shallow pools between moss-covered rocks. Ancient trees formed a natural canopy overhead, their branches weaving together to create dappled shade. "It's perfect," Ava whispered, already examining the natural features they could incorporate into their design. They worked methodically, following Dad's carefully drawn plans. The mesh netting was strung between trees to create a subtle barrier, camouflaged with branches and leaves. They used fallen logs and rocks to create natural boundaries, building them up carefully to ensure they looked undisturbed. Leo focused on the interior, arranging soft fabric and moss to create comfortable spaces where Noko could rest. He placed small platforms at different heights, remembering how Noko loved to perch and observe. Each addition was carefully thought out, designed to make the space feel like home rather than a cage. Ava worked on the technical aspects, setting up the wildlife camera in a nearby tree. She disguised it carefully with bark and leaves, positioning it to capture the entire area while remaining virtually invisible to the casual observer. "The motion sensors will alert us if anyone approaches," she explained, showing Leo the small receiver they would keep at home. "We'll know if someone finds this place." Throughout the construction, Noko remained in Leo's hoodie, occasionally poking his head out to chirp questioningly at the activity. His tiny claws gripped the fabric whenever Leo moved, as if afraid of being separated too soon. As the afternoon light began to soften, they stepped back to survey their work. The enclosure blended seamlessly into the forest, looking like nothing more than a particularly cozy, natural hollow. One side remained relatively open, allowing Noko freedom to come and go, while still providing protection from above. "Time to let him explore," Dad said gently, placing a hand on Leo's shoulder. Leo's hands trembled slightly as he unzipped his hoodie. He knelt down near the center of the space and carefully lifted Noko out, setting him on a flat rock warmed by the filtered sunlight. Noko stayed frozen for a moment, his large eyes taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. He looked back at Leo, chirping uncertainly. "It's okay," Leo whispered, his voice catching. "This is for you." Slowly, Noko began to investigate his new home. He hopped cautiously at first, testing each new surface. His confidence grew with each discovery, a perfectly sized hollow in a log, a patch of particularly springy moss, a shallow pool just deep enough for splashing. Leo sat cross-legged on the ground, watching as Noko became more animated. The creature rolled in a patch of soft moss, chirping with what sounded like delight. He discovered the fruit they'd laid out in small natural bowls formed by tree knots, sniffing each piece carefully before taking tiny bites. Ava arranged Leo's sketchbook near the sheltered area they'd created, leaving it open to pages filled with drawings of Noko. "So he has something familiar," she explained softly. "Something that smells like you." The sun was setting by the time Dad finally touched Leo's arm. "We need to head back before it gets dark." Leo nodded, his throat tight. Noko had settled into a cozy nook, watching them with those huge, intelligent eyes. When Leo stood up, Noko tilted his head, ears swiveling forward. "You'll be safe here," Leo managed to say. "I promise." The walk back to camp felt longer, heavier. Leo kept glancing over his shoulder, even after the glade had disappeared from view. Each step away from Noko felt wrong, like leaving behind a piece of himself. That night, sleep proved elusive. Leo tossed and turned in his sleeping bag, the empty space beside him too quiet, too still. He missed the soft chirping sounds Noko made in his sleep. The warm weight of him curled against Leo's neck. Sometime in the earliest hours of morning, when the world was still more night than day, a familiar sound pulled Leo from his restless dozing. A gentle chirp, barely audible through the tent fabric. Leo's heart leaped. Moving carefully to avoid waking the others, he unzipped the tent flap and peered out into the pre-dawn darkness. There, perched on a fallen log just beyond the dying embers of their campfire, sat Noko. His outline was barely visible in the dim light, but his eyes caught what little illumination remained, gleaming softly as he watched the tent. Their gazes met across the space between them. Noko chirped once more, a single clear note that seemed to carry both recognition and farewell. Then with a graceful hop, he disappeared into the shadows of the forest. Leo smiled through the ache in his chest, whispering into the darkness, "You remember the way back." The next 2 days settled into a bittersweet rhythm. Each morning, just as the sun began to paint the sky in soft pinks and golds, Leo would unzip his tent to find Noko perched nearby. The creature never stayed long, just enough time for Leo to see him, to know he was safe. Each visit ended the same way, a single chirp, then a graceful disappearance into the forest shadows. Ava diligently checked the wildlife camera footage every evening, documenting Noko's activities in their observation log. The nighttime recordings revealed a different side of their small friend. Under the cover of darkness, Noko became more adventurous, exploring the boundaries of his new territory with increasing confidence. He would splash in the stream, practice his mimicry of bird calls, and arrange the moss into intricate patterns that seemed to serve no purpose beyond his own entertainment. "Look at this," Ava said on the second evening, showing Leo the tablet screen. "There's been movement around the enclosure at night. See these heat signatures?" She pointed to faint blurs at the edges of the frame. Too small to be predators, too precise to be random animals. Leo leaned closer, hope flickering in his chest. "You think there might be more like him?" "It's possible." Ava zoomed in on one particular frame, where a shadow darted just beyond the camera's range. "Whatever they are, they're curious about him." Their quiet discussion was interrupted by a sharp ping from Dad's satellite phone. He had been checking it obsessively since their encounter with Ranger Collis, and now his expression darkened as he read the message. "The ranger station just responded," he announced, gathering the family closer. "They never sent anyone named Collis. There's no ranger by that name in their system." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture they all recognized as worry. "They're opening an official investigation now." Mom reached for his hand. "What does that mean for us? For Noko?" "It means we need help," Dad said firmly. "Real help, from people we can trust." He stood up, pacing the small clearing where they'd made camp. "I think it's time I made a call." The next morning, while Mom and the kids prepared breakfast, Dad hiked to higher ground where the satellite signal was stronger. He returned an hour later, looking both relieved and serious. "I reached out to Dr. Sarah Chen at the National Conservation Trust," he explained as they gathered around the campfire. "We worked together years ago, before I changed careers. She's one of the good ones, dedicated to protection, not exploitation." "What did you tell her?" Leo asked, anxiety clear in his voice. "Only what we agreed on. The behavioral data, your sketches, Ava's movement logs, and selected footage. Nothing that could compromise Noko's safety." Dad smiled reassuringly. "She's intrigued, but more importantly, she understands the need for discretion. They're willing to help, but on one condition: Noko remains free and unhandled. Their priority is protection, not research. When? Ava asked, already calculating what this might mean for their small friend. A small field team will arrive in 3 days. They'll set up monitoring equipment, establish a protected zone, and keep watch for any unauthorized personnel like our fake ranger. Dad's expression hardened briefly at the mention of Collis. It's the best way to ensure Noko's safety long term. Later that afternoon, while Dad and Mom discussed logistics, Ava called Leo over to look at the latest camera footage. Her fingers flew across the tablet screen, rewinding and zooming with practiced efficiency. There! She froze the frame, enhancing the image. Look beside Noko. Leo squinted at the screen. In the infrared footage, Noko's familiar form was clear, but beside him, partially hidden behind a fallen log, was another shape. Similar size, similar outline, but distinctly separate. Another one, Leo breathed, hardly daring to believe it. Ava, there's another one. They studied the footage together, trying to catch another glimpse of the mysterious visitor. The second creature remained mostly hidden, but its presence was unmistakable. Noko's behavior in the video changed too. More animated, more vocal, as if communicating with the unseen companion. We have to go check, Leo said, already reaching for his backpack. We can bring extra food, maybe. After dinner, Ava agreed, glancing at their parents. We'll tell Dad we're doing one last camera check before dark. The evening meal seemed to drag on forever. But finally, with their parents' permission and strict instructions to be back before full dark, Leo and Ava made their way to the enclosure. They carried extra fruit and some of the soft moss Noko favored, hoping to encourage his mysterious visitor to stay. The glade looked different in the fading light. Shadows stretched longer, and the stream's gentle burbling seemed louder in the evening quiet. They carefully arranged the food in several spots, making sure to leave clear paths between the offerings. There, Ava said, stepping back to survey their work. Now we wait. They found a comfortable spot on a broad, flat rock nearby, close enough to observe but far enough not to frighten any visitors. The sun continued its slow descent, painting the forest in deep blues and purples. Moths began to dance in the remaining shafts of light, and somewhere nearby, a whippoorwill began its evening song. Leo held his breath as the darkness gathered. Beside him, Ava sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the enclosure. The wait stretched on, marked only by the gradual emergence of early stars overhead. Then, just as the last real light began to fade from the sky, movement caught their attention. There, at the edge of the glade, 2 pairs of eyes gleamed in the gathering dark. They glowed a soft, ethereal blue, like tiny pieces of twilight given form. Noko wasn't alone anymore. The morning sun crept over the treetops, casting long shadows across their campsite as the family began the somber task of breaking down their temporary home. The air felt different now, heavier with unspoken goodbyes. Mom folded blankets with careful precision, while Dad sorted through their gear, making neat piles for packing. Neither mentioned the reason for the unusual quiet that had settled over them all. Leo sat cross-legged outside his tent, mechanically rolling his sleeping bag. His movements were slow, distracted. Every few minutes his eyes would drift toward the tree line, searching for a familiar shape that didn't appear. Ava worked nearby, dismantling their makeshift kitchen area, but her usual efficiency was missing. She kept glancing at her brother, her face softening with concern each time she caught him looking toward the forest. 2 more days, Dad said finally, breaking the morning silence. He stood with his hands on his hips, surveying their progress. The Conservation Trust team will be here Thursday morning. We should have everything packed and ready to go by then. Mom nodded, adding another folded blanket to her stack. It's the right thing, she said softly, though no one had argued otherwise. Her words seemed meant more for comfort than conviction. The morning passed in this way. Quiet work punctuated by meaningful glances and half-finished sentences. By early afternoon, most of the non-essential items were packed away in the car. Dad checked his watch, then caught Leo's eye. "Want to make one last trip to check on things?" he asked, his tone careful and measured. Leo nodded quickly, already reaching for his backpack. Ava set down the pot she'd been cleaning and moved to join them. No one needed to specify where they were going. The walk to the enclosure felt longer than usual. The forest seemed to understand the significance of this visit. Even the birds were quieter, their songs more subdued. When they reached the glade, Leo immediately noticed the missing fruit they'd left the night before. All of it was gone. Not even cores remained. "Look at this," Dad said, retrieving the memory card from the wildlife camera. He inserted it into the tablet they'd brought along, and they huddled around the screen. The footage started playing, and all three of them held their breath. There was Noko, moving with newfound confidence through his territory. But he wasn't alone. The second creature, similar in size but with slightly darker coloring, moved beside him. They watched, transfixed, as the two beings engaged in what could only be described as play. The creatures mirrored each other's movements, taking turns leading and following. When one would hop, the other would copy the pattern exactly. They shared food, taking alternating bites from the same pieces of fruit. Most striking was how they curled up together to sleep, their small forms fitting perfectly against each other like puzzle pieces. "They've bonded," Dad explained softly, his professional knowledge mixing with paternal gentleness. "In the wild, especially with rare species like this, human interference can do more harm than good once they form these kinds of attachments. They need to learn to rely on each other, not us." Ava nodded, but her eyes were fixed on Leo, who hadn't said a word. His face showed a complex mixture of emotions, pride, sadness, and something like acceptance beginning to dawn. Movement at the edge of the enclosure caught their attention. Noko appeared, emerging from behind a cluster of ferns. His movements were different now, more assured, more natural. He approached Leo with familiar affection, but maintained a slight distance that hadn't been there before. Leo took a few steps forward, kneeling at the edge of the enclosure. Noko came close enough to nudge his hand once, briefly, then turned back toward the forest. This time, unlike all the other visits, he didn't look back. His small form disappeared into the undergrowth with purpose, leaving only rustling leaves in his wake. They stayed a few minutes longer, but Noko didn't return. Finally, Dad placed a gentle hand on Leo's shoulder. "Time to head back, buddy." The walk to camp was silent, each lost in their own thoughts. When they returned, Mom had dinner started, something simple from their remaining supplies. The evening passed quietly as they continued packing, now with renewed purpose. While sorting through their gear, Ava came across the original observation notebook, the one where she and Leo had documented their first discoveries about Noko. She held it for a moment, running her fingers over the pages filled with their combined notes and sketches. Then, without drawing attention to the gesture, she slipped it into Leo's backpack. As night fell and the family prepared for bed, Leo took one last apple from their supplies. He cut a single slice and walked to the edge of camp, placing it carefully on a flat rock. The gesture felt both like an ending and a beginning, a final act of care for something wild and wonderful that had briefly touched their lives. Later, as midnight approached and the camp lay quiet under a blanket of stars, a small shadow detached itself from the darkness. It wasn't Noko. This was the second creature, its movements more hesitant but equally graceful. It approached the rock where the apple slice lay, pausing to study the silent tent where the family slept. For a moment, it stood perfectly still, as if memorizing the scene. Then, like smoke dissolving in the wind, it melted back into the waiting trees, leaving only empty darkness behind. The sun hadn't fully risen when the family drove away from their campsite. Morning mist created ghostly shapes between trees as they traveled down the bumpy trail. Leo pressed his forehead against the window, expressionless as he watched familiar landmarks disappear. Ava, unusually quiet, surprised them both by resting her head on his shoulder. She hadn't done that since before their mom got sick. Leo remained still, afraid to disrupt this unexpected connection, but felt some tension ease in his chest. Their parents spoke quietly about practical matters, avoiding mention of what they were leaving behind. The satellite phone waited silently in the console for updates from the Conservation Trust team. As they passed through the main gate, Leo glimpsed the forest one last time. The ancient trees kept their secrets. He thought he saw movement in the shadows, perhaps just leaves in the breeze. After returning home, life resumed its patterns, but their family dynamic had shifted. They communicated more openly now. The camping trip had changed them beyond their encounter with Noko. Leo continued drawing Noko in various stages, from vulnerable and trembling to stronger and confident with his companion nearby. One day, Dad called everyone to see enhanced wildlife camera footage. A slightly blurry but unmistakable image of Noko mid-leap, expressing pure joy. They framed this photo for their living room wall, proof of Noko's existence and life's unexpected magic. Dad received updates from the Conservation Trust. The field team confirmed Noko's species remained unclassified, but after initial sightings, the creatures vanished. Good news suggesting they'd found safer territory. Time passed. Leo turned 9, Mom's health improved, and Ava started high school. The framed photo gathered dust, was cleaned, gathered dust again. A year later, they returned to the same campsite. The next morning, Leo woke before dawn with a pouch of fruit. He followed the overgrown trail to Noko's old enclosure, now reclaimed by nature, and arranged the fruit on the same mossy rock as before. In the quiet forest, Leo heard the familiar knock-knock sound. Turning slowly, he saw Noko, taller now, with soft gray fur and eyes showing wild wisdom. Noko kept his distance, acknowledging Leo without approaching. 2 smaller forms emerged from behind a tree, moving with Noko's grace but showing no familiarity with humans. Leo smiled, understanding this moment wasn't about holding on, but witnessing. "You didn't forget me," he whispered, "and you didn't come back alone." If you enjoyed the story of Leo and Nico, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.